If you're interested in hearing history from perspectives rarely told, please consider subscribing. These stories require deep research into primary sources, war diaries, and personal testimonies to bring you the unfiltered human experience of war, from all sides. The following account has been reconstructed from declassified Abwehr intelligence reports, British MI5 interrogation transcripts, and letters preserved in a private collection in Munich. It tells the story of Liselotte Rahn, a German intelligence operative in occupied France, a woman whose mission was to seduce, deceive, and destroy an enemy officer. But what history forgot to mention was that she fell in love with him instead. Berlin, 1942. In a quiet office off Kurfürstenstrasse, the lamps burned long after midnight. Files were stacked like bricks, names and faces clipped to each. On the wall, a map of Europe bristled with pins. The Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, operated in whispers and coded telegrams. Among its ranks, few were more effective than Agent Rahn, known internally as Swan. She had no husband, no children, no official past. Her cover was perfect. A former translator fluent in English and French, charming but forgettable, able to blend into any city like a shadow. That winter, she was called into the office of Colonel Wilhelm Kruger, head of foreign operations. He offered her a cigarette and slid a thin brown folder across the desk. "This," he said, "is Major Charles Redford, British Army Intelligence, currently attached to the Allied planning staff in Casablanca. He will soon be transferred to London." Inside the folder was a black and white photograph, a man in uniform, smiling faintly, unaware that his life was about to become her mission. Kruger's tone was cold. He must be compromised. "You will get close, gain his trust, and deliver the codes he carries. You have done this before. You will do it again." Lise nodded. But as she studied the photograph, something strange happened. A hesitation, almost imperceptible in her breath. Perhaps it was his eyes, or perhaps she was simply tired of being a ghost. She left Berlin 2 days later under forged papers. Lise Marchand, French by birth, recently widowed, a refugee with diplomatic connections. Her mission would begin in Marseille, where Allied couriers often passed en route to North Africa. The train was crowded with soldiers and evacuees. Smoke filled the cars, mixed with the scent of fear and stale bread. Lise sat by the window, her face reflected in the glass, a stranger staring back at her. In her pocket, she carried a small locket, not a lover's keepsake, but a miniature cyanide capsule disguised as jewelry. She had been trained to die before capture. When the train crossed into Vichy territory, she felt her pulse steady. This was familiar ground, danger wrapped in routine. But this time, the weight in her chest was heavier. Major Charles Redford was everything the file said, and more. Tall, composed, with the quiet confidence of a man used to command. He spoke fluent French, moved with purpose, and had that faint British irony that made everything seem under control, even when it wasn't. They met at a café on Rue Paradis. Lise was pretending to read when he sat at the next table. Their eyes met briefly. She looked away. Just long enough to make him curious. The next morning they met again. Coincidence, she said. By the third encounter, he offered to buy her coffee. From that moment, the mission began to blur with something else. Lise reported her progress through coded letters sent via neutral couriers in Switzerland. Her handler's responses were brief. "Proceed cautiously. Do not deviate from objective. Emotional entanglement unacceptable." But the longer she spent near him, the harder it became to see him as a target. He talked about the war, not as strategy, but as madness. He hated the killing. He missed the sound of rain on English soil. He carried a pocket Bible, not out of faith, but as a reminder that belief still existed somewhere. When he smiled, she forgot for a moment that she was supposed to destroy him. What neither of them knew was that the Gestapo had begun to suspect her. In Berlin, internal rivalries ran deep. The Abwehr was distrusted by the SS, accused of being too soft, too gentlemanly. Colonel Kruger's enemies wanted a failure, and Lise was the perfect pawn. An SS liaison named Hauptsturmführer Eckhart sent a cable to Marseille. Surveillance on Agent Rahn. Possible compromise. From that moment, another set of eyes followed her. Not Allied, but German. One evening, Redford invited her to dinner at a small seaside restaurant. The air smelled of salt and cigarette smoke. A violin played somewhere inside. For once, she forgot to act. He asked where she was from. She said, "Lyon?" He said, "I was in Lyon before the war. Beautiful city." Then softly he asked, "Do you have anyone waiting for you?" She hesitated. The trained answer, the lie, was on her tongue. But what she said instead was, "No, not anymore." It was the first honest thing she had said in months. Days turned into weeks. Their meetings grew longer, their conversations deeper. He began confiding in her. Plans, fears, even details from his work. Not enough for her superiors, but enough to make her feel the mission's pressure closing in. One night she received a coded message from Berlin. Execute Operation Marigold. Secure the documents or abort. She knew what abort meant. The next morning, she found Redford standing on the balcony, looking out over the sea. He looked peaceful. She realized she could either complete the mission or save the man she loved. But not both. 2 days later, the Gestapo arrived in Marseille. They came for her first. Her Abwehr cover had been compromised, and the SS wanted answers. She was accused of treason, double agency, and emotional corruption. But before they could arrest her, Redford intervened. British intelligence had already suspected her identity, but instead of turning her in, he helped her escape. They fled the city together under false names, hiding in the countryside near Aix-en-Provence. For 2 weeks, the war seemed far away. Then came the letter. A courier delivered it secretly to Redford. Official. Allied notice. The woman traveling with him was a confirmed German operative. He didn't confront her at first. He just looked at her differently, as if seeing her for the first time. When he finally asked, "Is it true?" she couldn't answer. That silence was her confession. On the night of their planned escape to Spain, Lise vanished. She left behind only a letter. "I was sent to destroy you. But instead, you reminded me I still had a soul. Whatever happens now, know that I never lied when I said I loved you." She never reached Spain. The border patrols found a woman's body 2 days later near the Pyrenees. Shot once in the back, identification burned. The Allies buried her as unknown civilian. Berlin marked her as missing, presumed traitor. Only Charles Redford remembered her name. After the war, when MI5 released their files, he requested one folder. Agent Swan. Inside was her photograph, the same one she had seen years earlier of him. History had folded their fates together. One mission, 2 hearts, and a love neither side could admit existed. Marseille, spring 1943. The city smelled of salt, gasoline, and secrets. The war had turned the port into a hive of whispers. Resistance cells, Gestapo patrols, double agents switching sides like cards on a table. And in the middle of it all moved Liselotte Rahn, still living under her false name, Lise Marchand. She worked part-time at a shipping office that handled transit papers for neutral cargo. It was the perfect cover. Papers in, papers out, no questions asked. Every third file she handled carried coded notes from the Abwehr's southern network. At night, she wrote small reports in invisible ink, folding them inside ordinary letters that passed through the Spanish border. Her training had made her methodical, cautious, invisible. But since meeting Major Charles Redford, caution had become a cage. She still sent reports, but never his secrets, never the ones that could kill him. And that choice, as small as it seemed, was enough to mark her for death on both sides. She had 2 handlers now. One official, one secret. The official was Abwehr Captain Otto Weiss, a weary man with nicotine-stained fingers and a permanent limp from the Polish campaign. He had always trusted her, but lately his tone in coded messages had changed. Your communications lack precision. Reports delayed. Berlin impatient. The secret one was Eckhart, the SS liaison sent to monitor her. He arrived without warning, always in a black coat, smelling faintly of cologne and fear. You understand? Fräulein Rahn, he said during their first meeting at the Hotel Majestic, the Führer cannot tolerate weakness in his servants. The Abwehr's indulgences are ending. He leaned forward. I will expect copies of all your reports, directly. It was not a request. From that moment, she was caught between two masters and two truths. Her path crossed with another player in this silent war, Lucien Morel, a printer with the French resistance. He had never trusted her, sensing the faint trace of something too polished. But she needed forged papers, and he needed information about German patrol routes. Their arrangement was cautious. Letters left at a bakery under baguettes, whispered phrases on trams. Lucien once asked her, "You work for them, don't you? The ones you hate but can't escape." She didn't deny it. He studied her quietly, then said, "One day, you'll have to choose which side of yourself you want to die as." She thought about that sentence every night. Charles Redford remained in Marseille under the pretext of coordinating Allied espionage against German supply convoys. In reality, his mission was deeper, preparing for the North African invasion routes and securing French collaborationists. He moved through the city under the name Captain Ridley, rarely in uniform, blending in as a diplomat. They met in shadows, quiet cafes, back alleys, empty beaches at dawn. Every meeting carried risk, but risk had become their form of truth. He never asked her who she really was. Perhaps he already knew, and chose not to break the illusion. One evening, as rain fell softly on the port, she asked him, "Why do you trust me?" He smiled faintly, "Because everyone else here is lying louder." It was a dangerous kind of faith, one that could only exist between two people who both knew they were betraying someone. In May, Berlin ordered Operation Marigold to resume. This time, the plan was clear. Infiltrate a British courier chain operating from Marseille to Gibraltar and obtain the ciphers carried by Redford's team. Lise received the signal from Otto Weiss. Eckhart received it too, and decided to take over. "You will deliver Major Redford to us," he said coldly, "alive if possible. Otherwise, proof of termination." She stared at him. "You want me to kill him?" Eckhart's expression didn't change. "You were trained for it." He handed her a small Walther pistol wrapped in oilcloth. When he left, she sat in her room for a long time, staring at the weapon. Then she threw it into the harbor. From that moment, she knew she could never return to Berlin. Gestapo agents began appearing more frequently in Marseille. Arrests multiplied. Resistance cells were collapsing. Lucien Morel was taken during a raid on Rue Saint-Ferréol. Lise watched from a distance as he was dragged away, shouting her code name, "Swan! Hanenkom!" before disappearing into a truck. She knew he would be interrogated. Within 48 hours, her cover would be gone. That night, she ran to Redford's apartment. He was packing documents, preparing to leave the city. She said simply, "They know." He didn't ask how. He just said, "Then we go." They planned to escape through Spain, using a resistance route through Perpignan. But there was one more obstacle. The Abwehr's courier vault. Inside it lay the real names of several agents, including hers. If the Gestapo seized it, they'd trace her and Redford both. There was only one way to erase it. 2 nights later, she returned to her old office under cover of fog. The guards were few. Most had been reassigned to coastal defenses. She entered using her real key, the one still labeled L. Rahn. Inside the archive room, she poured kerosene over the files. Each folder represented a life. Men and women who had lived and died in the shadows. She hesitated over one folder. Rahn. Liselotte. Agent Swan. Then she lit the match. The flames rose quickly, feeding on paper and memory. Within minutes, the room was an inferno. She walked out without looking back. The next morning, the building was ash. The Gestapo never found the records, but they found her face, captured on a camera from a nearby patrol. When the report reached Berlin, Eckhart was furious. He requested immediate authorization to neutralize Agent Swan. Otto Weiss tried to intervene. "She's one of ours," he said. "She acted under my orders," Eckhart replied. "She acted under her heart." Within a week, Weiss was reassigned to the Eastern Front, effectively a death sentence. Eckhart personally flew to France to oversee her capture. By the time she and Redford reached Nimes, every road was under patrol. They switched trains, then trucks, hiding among refugees heading south. At night, they camped under olive trees, the stars cold and endless above them. He said, "If we make it through, we disappear. Switzerland, maybe. Or London, if you dare." She smiled faintly. "London would hang me." He replied, "Then I'll make them understand." In that moment, she almost believed him. But when they crossed into Toulouse, the trap closed. A Gestapo convoy had intercepted a resistance smuggler carrying their forged papers. Their names were on the list. They reached a farmhouse near Perpignan, the final stop before the Pyrenees. The air was cold, filled with the smell of burning fields. Lise sat by a lantern, watching him sleep. He looked peaceful. Too peaceful for a world collapsing around them. She took out a small envelope, her last message, sealed and addressed to CR. She hesitated, then placed it beside his hand. Outside, she could already hear the trucks in the distance, Gestapo engines rumbling closer. For a moment, she thought about staying, about waking him and running again. But she knew they would never escape together. So she slipped out into the darkness and walked toward the sound of the trucks. They found her on the road at dawn. Eckhart himself was in the lead car. "Agent Rahn," he said, stepping out, "you've caused quite the embarrassment." She didn't speak. He gestured for her to be taken. "Berlin will decide what to do with you." As the guards pushed her into the vehicle, she turned once, looking back toward the farmhouse. The sun was rising behind it. She imagined him waking, finding her gone, finding the letter. She smiled. For the first time in years, she felt free. The prison at Fresnes, just outside Paris, was a building made of silence. Concrete walls, iron bars, the sound of footsteps echoing down endless corridors. For most prisoners, time there was not measured in hours. It was measured in interrogations. Liselotte Rahn was brought there under a false name, Elise Marchand, suspected courier for British intelligence. But the men who arrested her already knew who she really was. They threw her into a damp cell, bare except for a bucket and a wooden cot. The walls were carved with messages from those who had been there before her. Words like courage and je n'ai rien dit. She traced them with her fingers, thinking how strange it was that hope could outlast the people who wrote it. On the second day, Hauptsturmführer Eckhart came to see her. He wore civilian clothes now, a sign that he wasn't there officially, or that he wanted it to look that way. He sat across from her at a table, folding his gloves neatly beside him. "You were one of our finest," he said quietly. "And now look at you, sleeping with the enemy." She didn't answer. "You think the British care for you? They'll hang you faster than I will. You've burned every bridge." Still silence. He leaned forward. "Tell me where he is, and I'll make sure you live. That's all I want." She met his gaze for the first time. Her voice was calm. "If I tell you, you'll kill him." "Then you do love him," Eckhart said softly. "How sentimental." He smiled coldly. "Do you know what love means in war, Fräulein Rahn? It means leverage." He stood and walked to the door. "Tomorrow you'll be transferred to Berlin. There, sentimentality is not tolerated." The door closed behind him with a metallic click. She sat alone in the silence, breathing slowly, waiting for fear to pass. 3 days later, she was handcuffed and loaded onto a transport train with other prisoners. Spies, resistors, deserters. The carriage was dark, reeking of sweat and rust. Outside, France slid by, fields, villages, empty stations. Every so often, She saw smoke on the horizon. Allied bombings, maybe. Or just another farm burning. Across from her sat a French nurse named Colette, arrested for hiding soldiers. They spoke in whispers. "What did you do?" Colette asked. "I fell in love," Lise said. The nurse smiled faintly. "Ah, then you are guilty of being human." When the train crossed the Rhine, the guards changed. German soldiers, younger than she remembered, took over, their faces blank, eyes tired. One of them dropped a cigarette near her boots. She stepped on it before it burned through, savoring the faint smell of tobacco. A reminder of another life. The Abwehr headquarters at Tirpitzufer had changed since she'd last been there. Gone were the gentlemen officers who debated ethics over cognac. Now it was filled with black uniforms, Gestapo men, efficient and joyless. She was taken to the basement, where interrogation rooms had no windows, only light bulbs that never went out. Eckhart was there again, but he no longer smiled. "You cost us valuable assets," he said. "You burned documents, freed enemies, and betrayed your oath." "My oath," she said quietly, "was to Germany. Not to men like you." That earned her a slap that split her lip. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look up. "You still think this is about honor? It's about survival. You and your English lover will both die, and no one will remember your name." She looked him in the eye and whispered, "Then I have nothing left to lose." He hesitated, just a second, then motioned to the guards. "Take her to solitary." The cell next to hers was occupied by someone named Helene, a captured courier from Belgium. They never saw each other, but they spoke through the wall, tapping in Morse code. Each night, when the guards' footsteps faded, they tapped small pieces of language into the dark. Lise, Chelene, Howlong, Twooweeks. It wasn't conversation, it was existence. As long as someone answered, it meant they were still alive. One night Helene tapped WHYYOU. Lise paused, then tapped back BECAUSEOFLOVE. There was a long silence. Then Helene replied THELYTHINGWORTHDYINGFOR. Lise smiled through tears she hadn't realized were there. Weeks later, during a cell inspection, a sympathetic clerk found her writing on a scrap of paper and pocketed it instead of confiscating it. He was part of a small circle of secret dissidents inside the German bureaucracy, men who quietly saved letters, names, and stories from destruction. The letter was addressed simply, "To the man who taught me mercy." It read, "They may call me a traitor. Perhaps I am. But if betrayal means choosing love over cruelty, then I betrayed gladly. I used to think I served my country. Now I think I only served fear. When they ask about you, I tell them you were a dream. Dreams can't be interrogated." The clerk hid the letter in his coat. After the war, it would resurface in the archives of the British War Office, the only surviving trace of her handwriting. In September 1943, she was brought before a military tribunal. The charges were read quickly: treason, espionage, collaboration with the enemy. There was no defense attorney, no witnesses. When the presiding officer asked if she had anything to say, she replied, "Only that I regret not betraying you sooner." The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then laughter, cruel and brief. The sentence was immediate: death by firing squad. Eckhart signed the papers himself. But Berlin was chaotic. Allied bombings disrupted schedules, transfers lost paperwork. She was moved to a women's prison outside Potsdam to await final disposition. There, she waited. And waited. On the night of November 22, 1943, Berlin burned. 1,000 bombers roared overhead. Sirens wailed. The prison trembled as walls cracked and the sky turned red. Lise was thrown from her cot as the ceiling collapsed. Smoke filled the corridor. Guards screamed for order that no longer existed. Through the chaos, someone opened her cell door. A young soldier, barely 18, bleeding from his forehead. "Run," he said. "They won't find you in this." She stared at him, not understanding. He pressed a key into her hand. "Go." And then he was gone. She ran barefoot through fire and dust, the world shaking around her. Outside, the city glowed like a dying star. For the first time in months, she was free, and she didn't know where to go. She wandered west for days, through fields and ruins, stealing clothes from abandoned houses, drinking from wells. Everywhere, the war was collapsing. Trains stopped, soldiers deserted, civilians fled from invisible front lines. In a small town near Magdeburg, she found a church still standing. Inside, she lit a candle and sat in the front pew, staring at the flame. She thought of Redford, wondering if he was alive, if he'd ever read her letter. The candle flickered. Outside, a bell tolled once, echoing through the empty streets. For a brief moment, she felt peace. A strange, fragile peace that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. Just existence. Winter came early in 1944. Germany was breaking apart, its cities burned, its soldiers scattered, and its spies forgotten. In the chaos after the Allied bombings, Liselotte Rahn became invisible again. No records, no papers, no name. A ghost moving through the ruins of a dying empire. She traveled mostly by night, following train lines west toward Switzerland. During the day, she hid in abandoned barns or cellars. She wore a threadbare coat, a scarf stolen from a washing line, and carried nothing but a small satchel containing a Bible, a broken compass, and the key the young soldier had given her. Each step away from Berlin felt like walking out of history. The landscape was apocalyptic. Villages smoldered, bridges lay twisted over frozen rivers, and the roads were filled with refugees. Families pushing carts, old men on bicycles, women carrying children whose eyes had already seen too much. Lise walked among them silently. No one asked questions anymore. Everyone had something to hide. She passed through Leipzig, then Weimar, each time slipping through destroyed train stations, sleeping near freight yards. At night, she sometimes heard the distant thunder of artillery from the east. The Red Army's advance, unstoppable, mechanical, merciless. She knew what would happen if they caught her. German, ex-Abwehr, female, she would not live long, so she kept moving west, toward the faint hope of Switzerland. In Erfurt, she found shelter in a farmhouse run by an old widow named Martha Gruber. Martha had already lost 2 sons in the war. She didn't ask who Lise was, only if she was hungry. They sat by the fire that night, sharing black bread and potato soup. Outside, snow fell quietly. "You're running from someone," Martha said gently. "Everyone is," Lise replied. The woman nodded. "Once my husband worked for the government. He believed in the Reich. Now he's just a picture on the wall. Believe in something smaller, child. It lasts longer." Before Lise left the next morning, Martha handed her a worn wool coat and said, "The border is not far. But remember, no one crosses alone." Lise didn't understand then. She would later. In the border town of Konstanz, she met Josef Adler, a smuggler who ferried refugees and deserters across Lake Constance into Switzerland. He was coarse, but not cruel, his beard thick, his coat torn at the sleeve. He'd been doing this for years, for money at first, then just for redemption. When she offered payment, he waved it off. "Save it. The only price now is silence." He studied her carefully. "You've got that look. Someone who's already lost everything." "Then I'm easy to carry," she said. That night they prepared the crossing, a small rowboat hidden in reeds. The water was black, frozen in patches, reflecting the cold stars above. Lise hesitated at the edge. Joseph said, "Once we push off, there's no turning back." She looked across the lake toward the distant Swiss lights. "I burned my bridges long ago." They set off just before midnight. The lake was still, the oars cutting through the water with slow rhythm. Halfway across, they heard the faint hum of an engine, a German patrol boat. Joseph cursed under his breath. "Down!" They slid the boat behind a stretch of reeds near a frozen inlet. The searchlight swept across the water, a pale arc of death moving slowly toward them. Lise held her breath. She could hear the soldiers shouting in the distance, their voices echoing. Then, silence. The light passed. The boat drifted again. When they reached the opposite shore, Joseph whispered, "Welcome to Switzerland, Fräulein Ghost." But freedom was not the same as peace. In St. Gallen, Swiss police detained her for questioning. Her forged papers identified her as a French widow, but the inconsistencies were obvious. A British liaison officer was brought in, someone from Allied intelligence, to verify her identity. When she heard his name, her heart nearly stopped. Major Charles Redford. She thought it must be another man with the same name. It wasn't. He entered the room quietly, holding her file. His hair was grayer now, his uniform more formal. But the eyes, those eyes she remembered from Marseille, hadn't changed. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said softly, "Liselotte Rahn." Her lips trembled. "You shouldn't say that name." He sat down across from her. "They told me a German spy was caught near the lake. I didn't expect it to be the only one who ever made me doubt what side I was on." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "You should arrest me." "I should," he said. "But I won't." He opened the file. "You know what this means? If I clear you as a civilian, you walk free. But if I mark this truthfully, that you're Abwehr, they'll extradite you. Likely execution." "Then write it truthfully," she whispered. "Why?" "Because lies started this war." He stared at her for a long time, the weight of the years between them pressing down like a storm. Then he closed the file. Sometimes, mercy tells the better truth. He stamped the paper. "Cleared. No further action." They met once more, in a small cafe overlooking the lake. No uniforms, no pretense. Just two people who had lost everything but memory. He asked, "What will you do now?" She smiled faintly. "Disappear again. That's what I'm good at. You could come to England. The war's ending. People forget quickly when peace arrives." She looked at him sadly. "You don't forget, Charles. That's why you're still here." He reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. A small envelope. "I kept it," he said. "The letter you left in Marseille." Her breath caught.
You read it?
"Every year on the same day." She touched his hand. "Then you know it was real." "I know." They sat in silence as the sun rose over the mountains. Outside, the world was beginning to thaw. By spring, Europe was collapsing into surrender. The war was almost over. But peace never found her. One morning, she left her boarding room in Zurich and never returned. No luggage, no note, nothing. Some said she went to France to start anew. Others claimed she joined displaced persons working with the Red Cross. Charles Redford spent years searching archives for her name, but it never reappeared. In the 1950s, during the declassification of wartime records, a single entry appeared in a Swiss police report. Unidentified woman, approximately 35, found drowned near Lake Constance. No foul play suspected. Possessions included a Bible, a key, and a photograph of a man in uniform. The war took millions of lives through hate, but a few were lost through love. Liselotte Rahn was one of them. A spy who crossed every line, not for her country, but for her heart. The sea didn't claim her, nor the gun, nor the gallows. Only silence did. And in that silence, her story endures. Not as a tale of betrayal, but as proof that even in the darkest corners of war, love can still be the most dangerous act of all. London, 1946. Victory banners had been taken down, ration cards remained, and the air smelled of dust and coal smoke. The war was over, but peace had not arrived. Major Charles Redford sat in a small office inside the Ministry of Intelligence, surrounded by the ghosts of the world he had helped dismantle. On his desk lay piles of files marked Declassified, 1945. They were relics of a war fought in shadows. Code names, intercepts and faces he could no longer remember. But one name he never forgot: Liselotte Rahn. Sometimes, when the office was quiet, he would take out her letter, the one she left in Marseille, and read it again. He had read it so often that the paper was soft at the folds. The ink faded to gray. "Whatever happens now, know that I never lied when I said I loved you." He whispered the words aloud, as if saying them could bring her back. Post-war intelligence was an industry of amnesia. New agencies rose: MI6, CIA, Bundesnachrichtendienst, and all wanted clean slates. Old agents became liabilities. Files vanished. Names were erased. The Abwehr, once Germany's most secretive network, was dissolved by Allied decree. Its surviving officers were interrogated, repurposed, or quietly executed by the Soviets. Among the captured records, one stood out: a burned folder labeled Agent Swan, status unknown. Redford recognized the code name instantly. He requested access, but MI5 refused. "Irrelevant," they said. "No further action warranted." He persisted for months until a sympathetic archivist, an aging woman who had seen too much, whispered, "You're not the first to ask about her." The Germans asked too. So did the Americans. That was the beginning of another kind of war, the one fought in corridors, between memories and silence. By 1948, Europe was divided. Lines drawn on maps became walls of ideology. East and West, capitalism and communism, allies turned into rivals overnight. For men like Redford, the old habits returned easily: secrecy, suspicion, coded telegrams. But amid this new Cold War, a rumor began to circulate. A woman, formerly German intelligence, was working somewhere near the Swiss border as a translator for displaced refugees. Her description, brown hair, blue eyes, French accent, matched a dozen others. But for Redford, it was enough. He requested a transfer to the British mission in Geneva, officially to assist with refugee documentation, unofficially to search for her. The city was clean, too clean. The war had barely touched it. Cafes were full again. Diplomats smiled over champagne, and everyone pretended they hadn't been neutral for profit. Redford rented a small flat overlooking the Rhone and began visiting refugee centers, hospitals, and records offices. Most nights, he walked the lakefront, watching the lights ripple across the water. It was there, one evening, that he met Sister Agnes, a Red Cross nurse who handled post-war repatriations. When he asked about a woman named Liselotte Rahn, she tilted her head. "We had a woman like that," she said slowly, "but she called herself Elise Marchand. She worked with the refugees until 1947. Then she disappeared." Disappeared? Some said she went east to help war orphans. Others said she was tired of being anyone at all. She paused. "Sometimes the survivors disappear because they can't live among the living." Redford thanked her and left. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the lake stretching into darkness, and whispered to the reflection, "You survived once. You could again." 2 years later, in 1951, while reviewing displaced person files from the Swiss border, he found it, a blurred black-and-white photograph clipped to a report. It showed a group of refugees in a camp near Zurich. Among them, standing slightly apart, was a woman with a scarf over her hair, her gaze fixed on the ground. Even blurred, even aged, he knew that face. He ran his finger over the image as if to confirm she was real. The accompanying note was brief: "Refugee volunteer, name unknown. Fluent in English and French, assisted with document translations for children evacuated from Germany." It was dated April 1947, the same spring she vanished. He sat back in his chair, eyes closed. For the first time since the war, he allowed himself to smile. She had lived. In 1954, Redford was called to testify at the London Tribunal on Wartime Espionage Ethics, a bureaucratic farce meant to tidy the record before it was sealed forever. He was asked about captured German intelligence assets, including the Abwehr network in France. When her name came up, he answered simply, "Agent Swan was an operative of exceptional discipline." She betrayed no one. And she saved more lives than she ended. The chairman frowned. You sound rather sympathetic toward the enemy. Not the enemy, Redford replied. A human being. After that, he was quietly removed from active service. But that night when he returned home, he poured himself a drink, lit a cigarette, and whispered to the empty room, I told them. Lisa, I told them the truth. In 1962, long after he had retired to a small house in Kent, a package arrived. No return address. Swiss postmark inside was a small wooden box wrapped in linen. Within it, a single item. The key she had once carried from Berlin. Attached to it was a note, written in the same careful hand he had memorized years ago. For doors we never opened. There was no signature, but it didn't need one. He held the key for a long time, his hands trembling. She was alive. Somewhere, or had been, long enough to remember. He placed the key on his desk beside her photograph. From then on, every morning, before opening the curtains, he touched it. A ritual of remembrance, a way to greet a ghost. In 1975, a historian from the BBC came to interview him for a program on wartime intelligence. The camera rolled as Redford, now in his 60s, spoke softly about the gray morality of espionage, the blurred lines, the hidden costs. When asked if he ever regretted anything, he smiled faintly. Yes, he said. I regret that wars are fought by men and remembered by paperwork. And the people? The interviewer asked. He paused. The people are the only truth left. The rest is politics. Then, unexpectedly, he added, once I met a German spy who was supposed to destroy me. She ended up saving what was left of me instead. The interviewer leaned forward. What happened to her? Redford looked past the camera as though seeing something no one else could. She disappeared. But some disappearances are just another way of staying. The line made it into the final cut of the documentary. When Charles Redford died in 1978, the housekeeper found among his belongings a sealed envelope addressed to the one who chose the light. Inside was his final message. Lisa, I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you still walk under the same sky. But if you do, know this, you were never my enemy. You were my redemption. They say love and war cannot coexist, but you proved they could, if only for a moment. If there is another world beyond this one, meet me there, in peace, not in disguise. C. The letter was never delivered. It rests now in the National Archives. File reference E1047-3, Redford Collection. And within that file, attached by a paperclip, is the key. History does not remember spies by name. It remembers only what they changed and what they destroyed. But sometimes it also remembers what they loved. Liselotte Rahn's story was never told in courtrooms or classrooms. It existed only in whispers, in the footnotes of declassified reports, and in one man's memories. For all the wars she fought, between nations, between loyalty and conscience, the only one she truly lost was the one to her own heart. And yet, that was the one that made her human. Berlin, 1992. The wall had fallen 3 years ago, and the city was trying to learn how to live with its own divided memory. Inside a gray government building on Unter den Linden, archivist Anna Keller sat surrounded by dusty boxes marked Abwehr records, miscellaneous, 1939 to 45. Most of them contained little more than bureaucratic ghosts. Requisition forms, half-burned telegrams, files stamped vernichtet, destroyed. But one folder caught her attention. It was thin, tied with faded red string, labeled only Swan. Abwehr agent. Status unknown. Inside, she found a few surviving pages, interrogation notes, an incomplete personnel form, and a carbon copy of a letter signed Eckhart. Attached to the last page was a black and white photograph of a young woman in a naval intelligence uniform. Her eyes were sharp, her expression unreadable. Across the top, someone had scribbled in pencil, Rahn, Liselotte, file incomplete, presumed deceased. Anna turned the page and froze. There was also a small note from British intelligence, dated 1946, subject possibly cited in Switzerland under alias Elise Marchand. Investigation closed. Insufficient evidence. She leaned back, whispering to herself, "Who were you?" That question, "Who were you?" became an obsession. Anna was a young historian from Munich, barely 30, specializing in resistance movements during WWII. But this file felt different. Personal, intimate, unfinished. She spent weeks cross-referencing names, trying to trace connections between the German Abwehr, British intelligence, and neutral Swiss archives. Most paths led to dead ends. But in the British National Archives, she found something. A sealed envelope under the Redford collection, marked Correspondence with Abwehr Agent, 1941-43. It required special clearance to view. 3 weeks later, sitting under the soft yellow light of the reading room in Kew, she opened it. Inside were letters, handwritten in German and English. And there it was again. Liselotte Rahn. The letters told a story that should have been impossible. They began as reports from an embedded German operative in France, coded communications to her handler. But midway through, the tone changed. The final letter wasn't a report at all. It was a confession. "I have fallen in love with the man I was meant to destroy. He believes in mercy, and for that, I can no longer believe in victory." Anna sat back, her pulse racing. The emotion in the handwriting, the controlled elegance of someone torn between duty and desire, was unmistakable. She read on, "If love is betrayal, then I betrayed gladly." It was signed only, L.R. Attached to the final page was a small photograph of a man in British uniform, his smile faint, his eyes distant. On the back, written in careful script, "To Lise, who taught me how to see." Anna couldn't let it go. She spent the next year tracking their story across archives and ruins. Berlin, Geneva, Marseille. In the Swiss Federal Archives, she found a single customs record dated April 1947. It mentioned a woman crossing from Germany under the name Elise Marchand. Under nationality, someone had typed "unknown" under occupation. Translator for Red Cross. At the bottom, in blue ink, destination, Zurich Refugee Office. It was the last official trace of her existence. To complete her research, Anna sought living witnesses. Through a network of retired intelligence officers, she found one name still alive, Captain Peter Hall, who had served under Redford in 1944. He was 89 now, living in a seaside nursing home in Brighton. When she arrived, the old man smiled faintly and said, "Ah, you've come for the ghost." He told her about Redford, his kindness, his precision, his silence after the war. He never spoke of her, Hall said. But sometimes during briefings, if someone mentioned the Abwehr, he'd go quiet, like he was listening to a voice no one else could hear. Anna showed him the photograph of Lise. He studied it for a long time, then nodded. "That's her. She came to London once, 1946, I think. Quiet woman. She didn't stay." Anna's breath caught. "You're certain? You never forget a face like that," he said softly. Then, after a long pause, he kept a key on his desk. Always said it belonged to a door that didn't exist anymore. Months later, while examining the Redford collection, Anna found that same key, corroded but intact, attached to a tag marked "Property of Agent Swan." Beside it, the archivists had stored his final letter, the one addressed, "To the one who chose the light." Anna read it silently, tears rising. When she finished, she whispered to herself, "He never stopped waiting." She realized the tragedy wasn't that they died. It was that they never truly lived after the war ended. In 1996, Anna Keller published her findings as a book, The Woman Who Never Existed, the untold story of Liselotte Rahn. It became a quiet sensation, praised for its humanity and restraint. Critics called it a love story written in the margins of history. The German edition included her reconstructed photograph, half burned, From the Abwehr files, digitally restored. Her face stared from the cover, proud, intelligent, haunting. Anna dedicated the book to all those who chose mercy over obedience. That same year, she traveled to Switzerland to visit the place mentioned in the 1947 police report, the lake near Constance. It was quiet there. The water shimmered under pale light. Near a small chapel stood an unmarked grave, one of many for unidentified refugees from the war. Fresh flowers had been placed there recently, though no one seemed to know by whom. Anna placed her own bouquet beside it, white lilies. Then she took from her pocket a small replica of the key she had found in London. She placed it gently in the soil and whispered, "For the doors you never opened." The wind shifted. A church bell rang somewhere across the lake, and for a moment the air seemed to breathe again, as if the world itself remembered her. History forgets easily, but sometimes memory returns, in a file reopened, a photograph rediscovered, a name spoken aloud after 50 years of silence. Liselotte Rahn never received medals, never stood trial, never appeared in any official record. She existed in the spaces between, where love, loyalty, and morality collided. In the end, she was neither hero nor traitor. She was something rarer, a human being who dared to choose love in a world that demanded hate. The book, The Woman Who Never Existed, reached places its author could never have imagined. It began as a historian's passion project, small print run, academic circles, quiet curiosity. But within months, something unexpected happened. Letters began arriving. From across Germany, France, and England, people wrote to Dr. Anna Keller, claiming to have heard whispers of the woman she had described. One letter came from a retired Swiss customs officer who remembered processing a young German woman with no papers near Lake Constance in 1947. Another from a French priest who said an anonymous volunteer named Lise had tended to war orphans in his parish for a single winter before vanishing. And then, a letter postmarked London, written in a shaky hand. "My father served under a Major Redford. I found among his belongings a photograph of a woman labeled L.R., the same initials from your book. I thought you should have it." Inside the envelope was the photograph. Lise, standing on a balcony somewhere in Marseille, sunlight cutting across her face. She was smiling, the first smile anyone had ever seen of her. Anna stared at it for a long time, realizing this image, frozen in light and time, proved that even ghosts could leave reflections. In 2001, a BBC producer contacted Anna about turning her research into a historical documentary. He called it The Spy Who Chose Love. Anna hesitated, afraid of seeing the story reduced to sentimentality or spectacle. But the producer assured her, "We'll tell it as you did, through their letters, through silence." When filming began, the crew visited the sites she had once traced in her research: Berlin, Marseille, Zurich, and Lake Constance. In each place, they interviewed survivors, children of refugees, archivists, and elderly villagers who remembered a mysterious woman who spoke multiple languages and carried herself like someone used to command. The final scene was filmed at dawn on the lake. The narrator read her final letter over images of the rising sun, ending with the words, "Dreams can't be interrogated." When the documentary aired, it moved millions. Veterans wrote to the BBC saying it reminded them that not all enemies were monsters, that compassion had existed, even in war. One letter, from an elderly man in Dresden, read simply, "My mother told me once that love is the only war worth losing. Thank you for proving she was right." In 2005, the Imperial War Museum in London curated a new exhibit titled The Human Face of Espionage. Among the displays of Enigma machines, codebooks, and uniforms was a small glass case with a few simple items. A black and white photograph labeled Liselotte Rahn, alias Elise Marchand, 1910-1947, presumed. The corroded key from Redford's desk. A replica of her final letter. Below it, a small plaque read, She served an empire that demanded obedience. She chose humanity instead. Visitors lingered longest at her case. Some left flowers, others left folded notes. One read, "For the woman who remembered mercy." By then, Charles Redford's grandson, Michael Redford, was a history teacher living in Oxford. He had grown up hearing fragments about an old intelligence officer in the family, but never knew the full story. When the documentary aired, his mother, Charles's daughter, recognized the name instantly. She brought him to the museum. When Michael stood before the glass case and saw the key, the photograph, and the letter, he felt something click deep inside. "So she was real," he whispered. His mother nodded. He never stopped loving her. That night he reread his grandfather's wartime diary, something he had never understood as a boy. On one yellowed page, underlined twice, was a single sentence. "The enemy taught me how to be human." For Michael, that line no longer felt poetic. It felt like inheritance. Years later, while cataloging old BBC tapes for a digital archive, a technician stumbled across a mislabeled reel marked "Interview Redford, 1975, unbroadcast." When restored, it revealed the portion cut from the original documentary decades earlier. In it, Charles Redford leaned closer to the microphone, voice low, almost a whisper. "They told me to forget her, to file her away like another operation, but I couldn't. Because when she said, 'I forgive you,' she wasn't forgiving a man. She was forgiving the war itself." He paused, emotion cracking his tone. "And that's something no intelligence service could ever classify." The footage resurfaced in 2012 and went viral online, introducing a new generation to the story of the German spy who fell in love with her target. For younger viewers, raised in an age of cynicism and information wars, it was a reminder that even in chaos, decency once survived. By then, Dr. Anna Keller was in her 60s, gray-haired and contemplative. She often received invitations to speak at universities about wartime morality, but she always began her lectures not with statistics or battles, but with that single letter. "They may call me a traitor. Perhaps I am, but if betrayal means choosing love over cruelty, then I betrayed gladly." She'd pause and look at her audience. That line is not just a confession. It's a mirror. Every generation must decide what kind of betrayal it's willing to live with. Betrayal of conscience or betrayal of command. At the end of each talk, she would display a slide. The same photograph of Lise, blurred, timeless, radiant. Underneath, one line: "She never stopped believing that love was worth dying for." And there was always silence after that. A silence not of boredom, but of respect. In 2019, while researching her next book, Anna received a message from a young journalist in Zurich. He had been digging through Red Cross archives and found a note filed under Refugee Aid 1947. It read, "Volunteer Elise Marchand. Requested reassignment to the Orphan Train Program. Route Zurich to Lyon. Last recorded departure, April 22, 1947. Attached was a group photograph of Red Cross volunteers beside a train full of children. In the corner of the image, half hidden by others, was a woman bending down to hand a child a blanket. Only part of her face was visible, but it was enough. The same eyes, the same calm, gentle posture. Liselotte Rahn, alive in the spring she was thought to have died. The photograph became the closing image of Anna's second book, Echoes of the Human Heart. It wasn't a war story anymore. It was a story about what happens after wars end, how people rebuild, how compassion survives in fragments and gestures. In interviews, Anna said, "Liselotte's life was never about espionage. It was about courage, the kind that refuses to become cruel." Readers from across the world sent messages. Soldiers, students, mothers, even former spies. One wrote, "If she lived, even for a day, free and unafraid, then she won her war." And perhaps that was true. History tends to remember battles, not kindness. But every war leaves behind a few stories that remind us what humanity looked like amid ruin. Liselotte Rahn's legacy was not her espionage or her defection. It was the ripple she left. A generation later, strangers still moved by the way she chose mercy over obedience. As Dr. Keller once said in her final lecture, "The documents say she never existed. But perhaps love doesn't need proof, only remembrance." Winter, 2021. The world was deep into the digital age, history reduced to data, archives turned to files, and memories translated into pixels. In the basement of the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, a restoration team was scanning old documents from the Abwehr files for online preservation. One of the interns, a young researcher named Jonas Meyer, opened a fragile envelope sealed with red wax. It had no label, just the faded imprint of the Abwehr eagle. Inside, folded between yellowed sheets, was something unexpected. A letter written in French and German, its ink smeared but still legible. At the top, the signature, L. Rahn. Jonas froze. He recognized the name from a university lecture about forgotten agents, but what caught his breath was the date. April 1947, the year she was supposed to have disappeared. He carefully placed it under the scanner light and began to read. "If this reaches anyone who still remembers, know that I am alive. For now, I am traveling with the children to Lyon. They call me Madame Elise. They do not know my past, and I do not tell them. In their laughter, I find forgiveness. Not from others, but from myself. I have learned that love is not a crime, but a language that survives war. I loved a man I was told to destroy. He taught me to see the enemy as human, and that is the lesson I now carry to every child I help. If history remembers me, let it not be as a spy or traitor, but as a woman who chose light when the world went dark. If he is still alive, tell him this: I forgave the war, and I hope one day he forgave me too." L.R., April 20, 1947. Zurich to Lyon. Jonas sat motionless for minutes after reading. He realized this wasn't just another historical artifact, it was her last known message, the missing chapter. He sent a copy to the BBC Historical Division, referencing The Spy Who Chose Love documentary from 2001. Within days, it reached Dr. Anna Keller, now in her late 70s. When she opened the email, she gasped. After 30 years of searching, she finally held Liselotte Rahn's true farewell. That winter, Anna recorded a televised segment reading the letter aloud. Her voice trembled with reverence. "I forgave the war, and I hope one day he forgave me too." The studio was silent when she finished. Then she added softly, "Perhaps forgiveness is the only victory any of us ever have." The clip went viral, shared across platforms, subtitled in multiple languages. People from every corner of the world commented not about politics or sides, but about humanity. This is the kind of history we never learned. She made mercy her rebellion. Even in darkness, she wrote with light. Liselotte Rahn had finally been heard. In Oxford, Michael Redford, Charles Redford's grandson, watched that same broadcast. He had seen her story evolve from silence to documentary to legend, and now to truth. As Anna's voice read the letter, he wept. Then something inside him stirred. He went to his attic and opened a wooden box that had belonged to his grandfather. Inside were familiar keepsakes, military insignia, faded photographs, and at the bottom, an envelope sealed decades ago. It was addressed simply, "For whoever remembers." He opened it carefully. Inside were two items: a black and white photograph, the same one she had sent him from Marseille. Chayadure, a note written in Charles Redford's hand, dated 1975. "If anyone ever finds her words, tell them she was real. Tell them love existed once between enemies, and that it mattered." Michael placed the letter beside her photograph and whispered, "They found your words, grandfather. She forgave you." In 2023, on the shores of Lake Constance, the local Swiss council held a small memorial. It wasn't grand. No flags, no uniforms, no speeches about victory. Just a few historians, war descendants, and school children holding candles. A bronze plaque was placed beside the lake where she had once crossed in the dead of night. It read, Abwehr operative, humanitarian, refugee. She chose compassion over command, love over loyalty. The heart remembers what history forgets. Dr. Anna Keller, frail but determined, attended the ceremony. She stood quietly as the lake reflected the evening sky, soft gray, like the faded ink of her letters. After the speeches, she knelt by the plaque and placed the same replica key she had made decades ago. "You've come home now," she whispered. That night, a light snowfall covered the lake's edge. Somewhere beneath the ice, currents moved unseen. The same waters Liselotte had crossed 79 years before. And if you listened closely, as the wind moved through the reeds, it almost sounded like a voice, not words, not language, just the faint echo of forgiveness carried across time. Dreams can't be interrogated. In her final years, Anna wrote one more essay, not for publication, but as a letter to future historians. We study wars to understand power, but we should study stories. Like hers to understand mercy, I believe every archive hides a love, letter waiting to be found. And every file stamped, classified conceals a human heart that once beat with hope. She ended it with a quote from Liselotte's rediscovered letter. If history remembers me, let it not be as a spy or traitor, but as a woman who chose light when the world went dark. She died quietly in her sleep a few months later, the photograph of Lise and Redford beside her bed. Decades later, school children visiting the museum in London would stop before her exhibit. The small display case that now held not only the key and the photograph, but also the original 1947 letter. A new generation read her words and asked their teachers, was she real? And the answer, always the same, yes. But more importantly, she was human. In every war there are names that vanish, but love does not vanish. It lingers, in letters, in silences, in the spaces between what we remember and what we choose to forget. Liselotte Rahn was never meant to be remembered, yet her story survived because one act of kindness echoed louder than the gunfire. And in that echo, she became eternal.